In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to do elbow control articular rotations. And so we're going to start going over the technique. So you're going to begin with your elbows extended, palms facing forward, because we're going to start in supination, okay? So from here, you're going to slowly cue supination by rotating the pinkies forward and as if you're trying to point your thumbs back. And then you're going to flex. And as you flex, you're continuing to try and rotate your thumbs towards the floor and your pinkies towards your face. Now, as you get to the top of elbow flexion, you're going to pivot through this long axis on the inside of that ulna, and then you're going to pronate. And when you get to end range pronation, you're going to slowly extend. But as you extend, you continue to squeeze out any more pronation that you have left. And when you get to the bottom, you have really two options. You can just reverse it, so maintain pronation and flex, right? And then reverse from there, or you simply do another rep. So you supinate at the bottom, get to the top, pronate, and you do that for however many reps you want, and you just reverse it. Okay, so let's talk cueing here. Number one, this is a controlled articular keyword rotation. So the emphasis is really going to be on the supination and the pronation. So before you start layering in flexion and extension, you have to make sure you maximize the rotation through the forearm. So I like to visualize like my thumb is rotating, and if I lead with my thumb, that's going to cue the forearm to really move a little better. Because if I don't know how to feel pronation, supination, I'm not going to be able to maximize that, right? But if I can see my thumb moving down that way or moving in this way, it's going to make sure that that motion is happening where I need it to happen. Second of all, as you go through this flexion and extension, you want to make sure that you squeeze out whatever tension you didn't really start with. Because when you're here, you can supinate really hard, but as you start to flex, you'll notice that some range of motion actually frees up. So you want to make sure you take up that slack as you go through that flexion. Because that pushing of that range of motion through that mid-range and then getting to end range at the top is what's going to allow you to maintain your positioning at your outer limits of motion, which is kind of what we're trying to do. Lastly, in regards to cueing, right? The long axis of that ulna is really where we want to focus, because when we get to the top, when we pronate, we don't want to just pronate like this, right? Or supinate, same thing. We want to pronate as if we're trying to flip our hand over that axis. That's going to ensure that we stay in line with that axis of rotation and we don't try and get some of that rotation from the shoulder. Because when you get to the top and you pronate and you just go like this, as you start to extend, you're going to almost stay in external rotation, right? Because if you think about it, right, if I get to the top and I pronate but I don't pivot over that axis, and my hands stay outside, as I come into extension, I'm staying in almost like an isometric external rotation of my shoulder joint. It's not what I want, right? I don't want my shoulders to get involved. So if I pivot through the right axis, I should stay in a neutral position. So you shouldn't actually see your hand travel in a straight line. You should notice it come onto one side of that axis, flip over to the other, and then come down. Which also reminds me to also make sure I talk about rotation to the shoulder joint. Very simple. When you go through these elbow cars, try not to let this rotation to the shoulder joint take over, because if you're missing supination, you're most likely going to try and externally rotate. If you're missing pronation, you're most likely going to try and internally rotate, okay? So just be conscious of that. If you notice your palm isn't completely parallel to the floor or the ceiling around this range of motion and you look like this, that's okay. Your goal is to kind of continue to work on this. Obviously, make sure you're supplementing some more work to try and improve that range of motion. But don't try and make your palms face up if you don't have that range of motion, right? Because you're only using a compensation to accomplish that. That's not the goal. The goal is to make sure you isolate through the joints that we're trying to isolate. In this case, the elbow joint, right? So, or more specifically, right, the pronation, supination happening through the proximal radioulnar joint, yada yada yada, right? Now let's talk irradiation. Once we understand how to bias pronation, supination, and we understand the rotation that we need to start with, when we layer in that flexion and extension, we want to try and see if we can add irradiation of the muscles that cross the elbow joint on the flexor side and the extensor side, okay? The reason is, once you load the tissues that you want with the rotation, when we add tension or irradiation through the other tissues, that's going to help increase some of that sensory information coming from that joint capsule, from the elbow joint itself, as we go through that flexion and extension. Now, if I start here in supination and I start to rotate, I can feel my supinator, some stuff happening in my shoulder or in my elbow. And as I start to flex, I co-contract my flexors and my extensors, so like I'm trying to swell my arm, my upper arm. Don't be surprised if you see some shaking happen. That just means you're really recruiting as much as you can through that elbow joint, because that extra contraction of those tissues is going to increase compression, which is great because that's the stuff that's going to give us that information from the joints up to the brain, and that's what we want, right? We want that feedback. We want that sensory information. Next, when you go through these motions from flexion and extension, you can toy around with the positioning of the hands. So if you wanted to, you can also start with a fist at the bottom, or you can go fingers super extended and spread. And the idea behind that is, because we know that we're layering on top of this supination and pronation, I already told you how to co-contract the stuff above the elbow joint. Co-contracting the stuff below the elbow joint is going to help just as much. And that includes some of the wrist flexor extensors and fingers too. That includes the flexors of the fingers in like this fist position. So you can toy around with hand positioning, finger positioning. I kind of want to let that experimenting happen and let you take care of that. But I want you to just feel the difference. Know, how does this change the motion or tension happening at the elbow joint? And that's going to help you get familiar with different variations of the elbow cars. All right, and so that's how you cue, some tips for the elbow cars and some compensations to look out for. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.